Hello, everyone. Welcome to this first interstate episode of the Superhero Ethics Podcast. I say that because I am Matthew, your host. I am coming to you today from my new home in Minnesota, and I'm joined today on the line by Jacob in his normal home of Wisconsin. Jacob, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. Of course, the weather between Wisconsin and Minnesota is so radically different that I don't know how you're dealing with such an abrupt change in your life. As sort of a peek behind the curtain for our listeners, Matthew and I were always recording remote from each other, even when we live, literally 8 minutes away from each other.
Pretty much, yeah.
And now that distance has increased significantly, but it's not going to be much of a change, except Matthew doesn't have to record from inside of a tiny boxed-in area now for audio quality.
My old apartment was a great place to live, but had a lot of crazy nooks and crannies in the walls and ceiling, which was not the best for acoustics. So I'm trying out a new location. You all can write in and tell us just how terrible this sounds, and we will keep improving it. I'm coming to a location that is also surrounded by cardboard boxes. We are almost done with unpacking. 10 minutes ago, I realized that I didn't know what box the headphones for my recording were, but we've gotten all that taken care of, and we're good to go. And today, we can talk for a while about my moving problems, but much more exciting. Today we're talking about not an MCU movie, but I think in many ways one of the best Marvel movies I have seen in a very long time. And that's the Into the Spiderverse. We've had 2 new Spider-Man movies in the last year or so. The new Tom Holland one, which I have seen. I think, Jacob, you have not, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so we won't be mentioning that one, but I will say I have really enjoyed the Tom Holland movies. But for me, at least, this was so far, flat out, my favorite Spider-Man portrayal I've ever seen. And I'm really excited to dive into it. We're going to talk somewhat about the movie itself and sort of the making of the movie and why that's pretty awesome, but also, and some of the ethical questions around that, but also some of the ethical questions around the stuff that happens in the movie itself. So, Jacob, let me just start. What did you think of this movie?
I loved it to pieces.
Yeah.
Both the generalized plot line, the focus of the Miles Morales character and his journey in the movie, I found very compelling, and very relatable. And I loved what they did with some of the other characters, some of the other iterations of Spider-Man. When we got our Doc Ock reveal, and I was like, "Oh, sweet! I'm really glad they're doing this." And then obviously, there was a good balance between fun humor bits, like there's literally a pig.
I should say right now, this should be assumed for everything we do, but major spoiler warnings. We're about to spoil everything about Into the Spiderverse, as well as pretty much every other Spider-Man property that's ever been shown.
Mm-hmm.
Continue.
So obviously there's an actual factual Looney Tunes character as far as you can tell, right? But also there's, some very serious issues going on up to and including what happened with Miles' uncle, right? That reveal was also very poignant, and the journey of Miles as a hero, I loved this movie a lot. I had very few problems with it.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I thought first of all, just as a New Yorker, this is one of the most New Yorker movies I have ever seen. Certainly one of the most New Yorker movies not made by Woody Allen. And that's a whole other story that, feelings on Woody Allen is a subject we're going to get into on a later podcast. But this also is about a very different part of New York, obviously. It's about the New York of color. It's about the New York of Brooklyn. And, especially given how much Peter Parker is very much a Queens character. And as much as I've loved some of the other Spider-Man movies, they never quite felt as much like, they felt kind of like the movie cinema, dream of New York, kind of like the TV show Friends. My actual friends in New York City would always roll their eyes like that's cute. That has nothing to do with actual life in New York City. This movie felt more like New York City than anything I'd ever seen. I really loved that. I really loved the characters. I loved the way that they balanced as you just said, the humor and the seriousness. I mean, there was some real tear-evoking moments, as well as just some of the funniest things I've seen You mentioned that there's a talking pig who's basically a Looney Tunes character, and at one point he actually quotes Looney Tunes, and then someone else says, can we say that without getting sued? I just like little fourth
Yep.
wall breaks like that were
Yep.
so good. Um, the thing more than anything that I was really impressed by, and I kept trying to figure out a way to make this an ethical question. It's really not, but I think it's worth commenting on. As listeners who've heard me and Jacob talk before, I am in general not a big animation guy. My brain doesn't register it very well. I really liked Korra. I really liked Avatar and a couple other things. Mostly, I'm not an animation guy. In this, the animation blew me away, especially in the way that they used animation to do like, it wasn't just we're going to draw a picture of what would appear on the screen. They used animation to make the most a comic book appearing on screen movie I've ever seen.
Yeah, they did things in this that the only other film I've really seen do well was Sin City, and
Mm,
that's a bar, right? Like, not that Sin City's a perfect movie by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, there's many issues you could take with it. Most of them are with the source material itself, but but the framing, literally the framing part, is so good when you do it well, and so hackneyed and unnecessary when you don't. And
yeah.
it was perfect for this. It felt like I was reading a comic book that moved around.
And just there were so many moments where like the thought bubbles would appear. Um, there was what I was not the first to point this out. There was an article I read about this that pointed this out, but I want to repeat it. And I can't remember the article, but it mentions the moment when the two Peters or no, Peter and Miles are in the laboratory and they're running to get away, and he'd already grabbed a bagel and he throws it at someone's head, and it hits the person in the head, and just the word bagel appears as like the sound effect. And I just thought that one moment
uh,
was so good.
mm-hmm.
Um,
And
oh, go ahead.
yeah, you've got in addition, the I lost what I was going to say. We were talking about the visual style, we're talking about the animation style, and the comic book style and the comic book feel. Oh yes. The fact that they decided that there wasn't going to be, like, all of the Spider-Men got bit by a radioactive spider if they were going to be bit by a spider. And I
Uh-huh.
was like, thank you for just completely throwing out the Tobey Maguire version where it's now a biologically, genetically engineered spider.
Oh God,
Uh,
yeah.
and
I'd forgotten about
Yep,
that. So
yep, because that was the hot science then, right?
right.
And so to sort of like return it to its roots, I really appreciated the idea that we were sort of being like, no, 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 this is Spider-Man. This is the origin.
Yeah, I like that a lot, and I part of what I liked so much, and we'll get into this more when we get into the kind of meta-ness of it, is, obviously this is a very new Spider-Man. The Miles Morales character is, I believe, less than 10 years old. It's quite new, and I will later actually I learned recently about the origin story of this character, like as it appearing in comics, not in the story origin story. Because it's pretty awesome, and I loved that they were both doing so much to say, let's take Spider-Man out of the white boy from Queens and put it into a people of color story and really make it such a new dynamic kind of world that we've never seen, but also pay so much homage and so much love to the roots of Spider-Man. Um, like you could have done this in a way that the original Spider-Man who he meets, the Christopher Pine character, just appeared as a buffoon, and that Miles was clear, and the fact that his character was presented so lovingly, and yeah, kind of ridiculous with his Christmas album and all that,
Mm-hmm.
but that wasn't done to mock him. It was done as sort of loving send up humor instead of mockery, and then to have that, and then to have all these other people from the Spider-Verse drawn in, um, and just the way that they were animated being so in, like, I don't understand art much. My partner does, but she was telling me about how, like, the character who is, basically the anime girl with a with a spider robot, like, she's animated in a very anime style, and the noir character is very much done in kind of that sort of old 1930s comic style. And
Mm-hmm.
the way they used the visuality of it to tell the story and to pay homage to all that just blew me away.
Yeah, getting into the getting into the character himself, because as Rob and Steve and I discussed in the Roshar episode when we were talking about the Knights Radiant, we were talking about Spider-Man as like one of the best examples of a champion of the people, of the protector of the little guy, care about the little guy kind of hero.
Right,
There's something very powerful with putting that ideology, building that kind of hero into and having the hero be a person of color, having that person be the champion of the little guy, right? The person who's watching out for your everyday people on the street. I think that's
right.
great, rather than it being, because otherwise you do unfortunately get into the a little bit of the white savior trope, right? It's unavoidable.
That that's a good point that I hadn't even thought of, and I think that's a really important one. And I just there was so much about, especially because when like it's funny when I keep thinking about Miles, uh, it is difficult to talk about in a way because he is a character and this is a story that a little bit defies expectations. And again, this feels very New York to me. Um, in part because he is a character who is mixed race. He is black and Latino. And he's clearly a fusion of those two in a way that there isn't tension, but just the dynamic between his parents, for example, where one parent is his father is speaking to him constantly in English, and the other parent, his mother, is speaking to him often in Spanish. Um, and one of the things that I think of most when I think about growing up in New York is how much the blending of those things, that there wasn't a clear like black community versus Latino community, but really a great intermingling in a lot of ways. Um, and yeah, the way that this movie takes that idea and melds it with the idea of the savior of the people, I really loved that, and this is an issue we were going to get into, especially with the way that towards the end they really harp on the idea of um, that everyone can be Spider-Man. What was your kind of take on that? Because it sort of develops first as just Peter telling Miles he can be Spider-Man, but then more and more, both with Mary Jane's speech at the funeral and some other scenes, they seem to really playing out this idea that kind of the Spider-Man thing can be anybody. What was your take on how they handle that?
And well, obviously, I really liked it. It's a case where it's similar to the whole being super project idea, right? Where it's this idea that um all it really takes is somebody who's willing to take the stand and make the right choices and try to make a difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very powerful message. It's very uplifting. Um, Obviously, in we live in a world where it's not always easy or even plausible to do, but I do still like the message. I like the idea that, and the sort of optimistic ideological principle that anybody, given the right impetus, can do this.
Right.
And rather than saying, well, it has to be specifically you, and falling into the destiny and the and fate type of stories you sometimes get with heroes, where it's like, well, it can only be Batman, it can only be Bruce Wayne.
And let's actually get into that because I know that was an issue you wanted to talk about. Was getting into some kind of the ethical and moral questions here. You have a movie here in which, on the one hand, all of what you just said is correct, but on the other, it does seem at least that it starts out going in the very opposite direction, where in every universe, either there's a Peter Parker himself who becomes Spider-Man, or Peter Parker's best friend in the case of Gwen Stacy, or Peter Parker doesn't quite connect as much with the Noir or the Pig, but certainly the idea that there has to be some version of a Spider-Man in all these universes. How do you think they dealt with that issue? Because as you said, I think there can be something problematic sometimes about the idea of, well, all these people have to be the same, and no matter what universe it is.
Well, I think there was sort of an easing the audience into the idea, right? We started out by getting an alternate Peter Parker, and turns out we had already seen a Gwen Stacy, right? But but we didn't know necessarily at the time. The audience wasn't explicitly told that's what was, or rather, we knew she was Gwen, right?
Right.
But we didn't know that she was actually already powered from an alternate universe. Um, and then sort of as we got some of these other characters, like none of Spider Pig, the Noir Spider Man, or the uh Spider. What did they call her? The one, the anime girl. I don't
Right, I think she
actually
was
remember the
Spider
name
Girl.
of the.
I'll look it up actually as
Was
we
it Spider
talk.
Girl? Right, like who's got the ghost of her father in a spider robot or something. Like it was a cool story that they told really really fast for her origin. But like, so they started with just like, oh, it's Peter Parker, and then very quickly, like when we got more Spider-Man from more alternate universes, the only thing that remained constant was that there was a Spider-Man, but not, but it wasn't always Peter Parker,
She is
right?
Penny Parker, so
Penny
there it is
Parker,
obviously a
right,
pretty similar name.
right. And part of this, like, you could wave away as it being a like, you know, the dimensions that are closer to this particular world line are gonna have more similarities than ones farther away, and so those are the ones that are gonna get sucked in first. You could sort of massage this to make sense why they're similar, but it's not always the same. It's not the person. It's not an iteration of that person in a different timeline always who becomes Spider-Man, but somebody becomes Spider-Man, and that kind of plays into this whole anybody can be Spider-Man idea,
Right.
right? And so it sort of reinforced that statement.
When especially in the way that they developed even just from the very beginning the small differences. Like even if you take we do meet two full on Peter Parker characters. And even those two are presented as somewhat different. One is that they are at different ages. Two is that they have radically different relationships with Mary Jane. Um, and the other, and this was such a small moment, and it was a kind of like blink and you miss it thing. But on the one hand, we established that, the Prime Universe of Spider-Man, I think, is pretty clearly supposed to be Christian, the way most of them are often presented as. I generally get a kind of an Italian idea, at least from the Aunt May. Although that's more just Marissa Tomei in the most recent movie, so
Hmm.
disregard that. But certainly, he's singing these Christmas songs and all this kind of stuff. And then Peter Parker from the first alternate universe is Jewish. And the only reason a lot of if people are wondering how in the world I know that, or I'm saying that, is in the very quick origin story when they mention his wedding to Mary Jane, they show him smashing a glass at the wedding, which is a very, very specifically Jewish thing.
Hmm.
Um, and I just loved that because I thought it was such an interesting, like, okay, yeah, by some weird trick of fate, there is a Peter Parker in both these universes, and they don't become Spider-Man, but they're actually completely different people. Um, and I thought that was an interesting way of kind of taking the stuff that a lot of these books had used to do, of saying, okay, in all these alternate universes, most things are going to be exactly the same, and saying, okay, we're locked into that somewhat, but let's play with it. Let's change it around some.
Yeah, and I do really appreciate the idea of people who are from an alternate dimension or who are, have the same name and most of the same uh, superhero origin story still aren't anywhere near the same people. They react to things differently. Either they're at different points of their lives or they've had different life experiences.
Yeah.
This was one of the things I'm hoping they're not going to do with uh with a MCU post Endgame, right?
Mm,
Where I'm really, you and I talked about this, I think during our Endgame conversation, right? Where I think they can't possibly do the thing where they do like 50 First Dates with Gamora and Peter Quill. Um,
yeah.
but I'm concerned that they might, because there is this idea that, like, even though Gamora has now had a completely different life experience than the Gamora that Peter knew, there's this possible idea that, like, oh no, they're the same people and like destiny, fate, blah 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 blah. It's such a load of garbage. Which is why I really like that people with the same name, with similar experiences, but not the exact same experiences, don't end up being the same people.
Yeah.
And that's very important to me, just from a like storytelling perspective, that we're not locking into this idea that, well, if I clone you, the clone's going to be exactly like you, because all that matters is this very deterministic thing. Like, all that matters is your compositional makeup,
Oh
and
yeah.
nothing in your environment matters at all, and that's just a load of hooey. Uh,
This is kind of going on in a very different direction, but it's a connection I've made before. And again, this isn't really a spoiler because it's very early established. One of the things that I like so much about the Clone Wars TV show, about in the Star Wars universe, is it explores exactly this idea that you have an entire army made up entirely of clones. but that as they grow and develop, some of them were in this battle and some of them were in that battle, and that creates fundamental differences. One
Hmm.
tripped over a rock and the other didn't trip over a rock, and that makes them different, like
Yep.
just really highlighting it. The other thing that I was thinking of as you talked, and I hadn't really thought about this before, but the more I think about it, the more I think it definitely happened, and I think it must have been intentional, is, you know, as always happens, because the internet is really dumb, whenever you get a character that has traditionally been a straight white cis man, and then let that character or a version of that character be played by anything that isn't all of that, you're always going to get a huge bunch of hate and a huge bunch of idiots. And it felt like one of the things that this movie, in some ways, if this movie had been, six different exactly looking Peter Parkers from different universes all confronting Miles, that would have felt really weird, because I think it would have
Hmm.
highlighted even more the otherness of Miles.
Yep.
But instead, what they did was to say, yes, Spider-Man is often Peter Parker, but he's also been all of these other things. We've had women spider people. We've had black and white spider people. We've had spider pigs. We've had, all of these things. Into which saying, and so isn't it kind of actually ridiculous that we've never had a black or a Latino spider person, but that actually it isn't that different to have, a new kind of spider person. I loved that, because I thought it highlighted the idea that the Spider-Verse is much more diverse than the people who just think of it as, all Peter Parkers and then now his, person of color sidekick or whatever.
It's the Spider versus Spiderverse.
Oh, God.
You can fire me anytime you want, Matthew.
Anybody want to be a new host? 'Cause I'm certainly not firing you until I
You
have
can
that.
you can send a message to at oh goodness, I don't know your Twitter handle off the top of my head. Superhero ethicist,
It is Caped Ethicist.
caped ethicist. Oh goodness. Now everybody knows how bad I am at social media.
See, here's the thing, though. I am going to keep you on this podcast for many reasons. I think you're a very helpful part of the podcast, despite your puns. But also, I care deeply about your wife, and I'm not going to subject her to you having to have all these opinions without any other outlet for them. But
uh,
so, let's actually just talk a little bit more about that idea of representation, because uh, I think another reason why I liked this so much is that in a lot of ways, this very much reminded me of Black Panther and Luke Cage, in that it wasn't just that you had a person of color who was the star. It was that the entire world felt so much like the music was so much influenced by not just rap, but like rap and hip hop and Latino music and reggaeton and different things like that. And that the entire world felt so, honestly, felt very different than the world that I, as a person of, as a white person, inhabit. Um, did you get that same kind of thought? Like, did it remind you at all in that regard of like a Black Panther or a Luke Cage?
it reminded me more of Luke Cage only insofar as the environment and a little bit the music, but mostly the environment that we're dealing with an area where you've got a much more ethnically diverse community than we're seeing in, well, quite frankly, many other television shows even today. Um, and I, again, really appreciate that. Obviously, like my experience growing up in small town, incredibly Caucasian America is nothing like that. So I really like seeing things like that, but I have no way of knowing if they're authentic. That's
Yeah.
the like right. So I'm seeing it, and I'm like, oh, this is cool and different. I like what they're doing here. Um, is this good, or is this somebody interpreting things incorrectly? Like, I don't know.
Yeah. And like I said, it felt a lot to me like the New York that I knew, but I was always like, as a white person, I spent a lot of time in parts of New York where as a white person I was the minority, but so I could relate to some of it, but certainly my experience as a white, there's still elements to this experience that I have no concept of, and I have heard from many other commentators, who I greatly respect, who are people of color, how authentic this movie rang to them. But I think you make a good point that that's not that one element is not something you and I can comment on with too much accuracy. But that it's, again, I think it's important, and I would say, especially anyone listening to us, take our thoughts in, but really seek out some of the voices of people of color talking about this movie as well, because I think there's some really great perspectives they have that we can't bring. Um, Did you have any other things about kind of the meta-ness of the movie in terms of it being made and the stuff about that we're talking about before we wanted to jump into the questions from the movie itself?
I mean, in general, when I first knew the movie was coming out and it was a Marvel Universe movie, but wasn't going to be part of the mainline MCU and was this animated feature, I was like, well, this is weird that it's going to theaters. There've been many like Iron Man or Avengers or Thor animated features that didn't go to theaters, it just went directly to video. And I thought to myself, well, who is this for, right?
Right.
And then after I saw the movie, I went, oh, this is for literally everybody. So it was kind of refreshing, and I almost like part of me really wants, now that we've done at least something in the mainline MCU to show that you can create branching timelines.
Yeah.
I would like this. I would actually like this to be folded into the MCU proper. I would love to see Miles show up in like some of the new television shows that are going to be on Disney Plus or whatever.
That would be pretty great. And I'm fairly certain that very briefly, but I believe we have met Miles Morales in a Spider-Man movie in the MCU at this point.
Oh,
Um, I don't even think I'm spoiling anything. So I think that was like a very brief reference in the last movie, the Homecoming one. Um, my memory may be off here, or may even be that it was something even like that they mentioned.
nope. Your memory is not off. Yep. And there's yep. Nope. Sorry. Just decided to look that up. Yeah.
Awesome.
Continue.
So what is it? What is that? Did you see exactly what it is?
So not only was there a subtle reference in Homecoming,
Uh huh.
um, there was a deleted scene from Homecoming that was far more explicit.
Nice.
In like this character exists in this universe. Um, so I I'm kind of hoping that just means we're gonna have multiple Spider-Men because I do really like our Peter Parker, but like
Yeah.
if our as long as our Peter Parker, if our Peter Parker has to die, I hope they just don't, that he doesn't die for like the emotional motivation of another character and no other reason. But we'll see.
Yeah. No, I think that would be pretty awesome. Um, I will also say I wanted to kind of tell this story quickly because I only learned this recently, and some of our listeners may know this already, but I think it's really wonderful to hear this because it's a reminder that the conversations that are happening have value and mean something. Because the story, at least that I understand about how the Miles Morales character came to be, and this is told by Mark Bernardin, who is a black writer and commentator about comic books and things like this. He was very involved in the Stephen King Castle Rock project, and he is Kevin Smith's partner for what used to be the Fat Man on Batman podcast, and now is Fat Man Beyond. Um, but the story that he tells is that whatever it was, 10 or 12 years ago, when they were casting who would eventually become Andrew Garfield for that, set of Spider-Man movies, he wrote an article saying, why can't there be a black Spider-Man? And actually, why can't there be a black person cast as Peter Parker? And he got apparently a huge amount of hate mail, and it became a big thing, and really kind of it was kind of like the Ghostbusters, all the crap that happened around that, and the black woman who was involved in Ghostbusters being so badly harassed. It was kind of a version of that playing out about 10, 12 years ago. But that what eventually happened was, as part of that, it got a lot of media attention, and that the writer, I believe Brian Michael Bendis, although again I'm not positive on that, but that a writer reached out to Mark Bernardin and said, "Hey, I really think your idea here is kind of cool. Are you okay if I run with this and try to explore what would
Hmm.
a person of color who was Spider-Man look like?" And Mark Bernardin said, "Sure," and that's where the character of Miles Morales came from. And again, that's the story as told by Mark Bernardin on a podcast on which both him and Kevin Smith smoke a lot of pot. So,
So it's more of a podcast, is what
yeah,
you're saying.
exactly. So take all the details with a grain of salt there, but I believe that is actually the case, and I think it's a great example of how, it can see. I know people get annoyed by it. I think that's wrong because I think this is an important part of this whole media. but that when people are raising those questions and saying, why can't we have a woman, or as we're going to get a woman Thor now, which is great. We've had a woman Thor in comic books for a while. We're now going to have Lady Thor in the movies. That these questions when people ask, like, why can't we have a gay superhero? Why can't we have this? Why can't we have that? That those lead to really good things, at least sometimes. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, we are going to have a conversation at some point about fan reaction thus far to Lady Thor, almost assuredly.
Yep.
Both the casting decision and the storytelling decision, because I think they both have slightly different plot threads, if you will,
Yeah.
surrounding them. But yeah,
A quick aside on that, I'll just say I have been so disappointed by how the movies had used Natalie Portman, who's such a great actor. And so I'm really excited for that.
I don't
Um,
understand why they put her in the role of a scientist and then didn't write a good scientist character. Like,
oh, the,
why? Natalie
yeah.
Portman is fantastic as an actress. Why would you do that? Anyway, moving on.
So yeah, back to Spider-Verse. Let's talk about some of the questions from the movie itself. You know, as anyone who's listened to this I imagine if you did a word cloud of characters, um, Daredevil might be the first of this particular podcast, but the person who might be number one and certainly will be number two is Kingpin. Um, and here, you and I have talked at length about how much we love the Vincent D'Onofrio Kingpin. Here we get a very different portrayal of Kingpin. What did you think?
Well, first of all, his his character as animated is unsettling. He has literal no neck. So there's that.
A head emerging horizontally out of a pair of shoulders.
Yep, out of a pair of shoulders, and is almost entirely torso with two little legs.
Yeah.
So very stark caricature. Obviously this is a very different kind of character from Vincent D'Onofrio. The main similarity is that they both have anger issues, right? Um, and the thing in particular that I appreciated about this Kingpin was that his motivation, while selfish, wasn't completely unrelatable,
Hmm.
right? I don't think it makes sense, especially given that, as we were just talking, the whole assumption that people from different universes with the same name and look are going to be anything like each other is ludicrous. And yet his whole goal is to try to get his family back. Um, and the fact that he blames, but it's a very human thing, right? He blames Spider-Man for something that Spider-Man actually didn't have anything to do with. It was all his fault. Right? The whole problem
Right.
was that, yeah, the whole problem was Kingpin was doing Kingpin things, and his family left because, yeah, they wanted out of that situation. Vanessa wanted out of that situation, and there was a kid, right? I'm not misremembering this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep,
It was the idea that he had kind of scared away his family in the
yep,
past by them seeing his violence.
yep, yep. But blame Spider-Man because to blame himself would be to acknowledge that he has to work on himself, and like you can't do that as a man. I know.
Yeah. I at first it threw me. He didn't look the same. He didn't sound the same. And at first I thought he came off much more mustache twirly, much more comic book villain, especially the way he was drawn. Um, but what I realized by that midway through is how much you're right. His idea doesn't make sense and isn't necessarily like it's not like a Killmonger or a Magneto where I'm like maybe you have a point. Like he's clearly like this is not a good idea. Um, but I can at least be sympathetic. I can understand where he's coming from. And it's, one thing we've talked about when we talk about the nature of villains is the idea that kind of like, the villain's fatal flaw that is the thing that winds up being their undoing. And in the case of Kingpin, it's always been, at least in the comics, they haven't played with this quite as much in the show, but it's there somewhat, that his anger he doesn't have control of. That, and of course, actually, they play with a lot in the show. Um, but that he can lose control of his anger and he has this image of himself as a helper and a protector, but that other people see him as scary because of the way he loses control of his anger.
Hmm.
And they did it so quickly and with barely any dialogue, but this movie established that so well. And I was just like, this is such an interesting side of Kingpin that the TV show shows us somewhat, but the movie is getting at so much more. And that it's that horrible cycle he's in where he showed his anger without meaning to, and it scared away the people he loves. And now, in his attempt to fix what happened because he showed his anger, all of his anger is coming out once again.
Right, that's an excellent point. Um, I don't have a springboard off of it, so
Sorry,
uh
that's my fault. I just kind of like went on
no,
a.
no, like I can't springboard off it because you said everything that I wanted to say and some other things that were very valuable and very cool that you said. So like bravo.
Thank you.
Um and I also like so sort of the way he ends up interacting with the cast of heroes, and he sort of just keeps doubling down on this, right? Um, is fascinating to me. I sort of like this is my hope in almost every movie is I really want to have the argument scene between a villain and a hero. I really want them to like talk through why what the villain's doing doesn't make sense or isn't right,
Uh
and I
huh.
don't always get that. And here, if like we're talking about, hey, if you do this, we're gonna, you're gonna collapse the whole world or something or whatever the wubba wubba that he was doing was actually gonna do to
Right.
right to destroy the world or change life forever, and you don't have a right to do it, but never got to talk about like his central motivation. Like I one of the things I wanted, I would really love to see was somebody saying this won't change anything, this doesn't bring her back, right? this
Right.
is this is somebody else entirely that you're taking away from someone like you, if you believe that they're like her.
And
And
and you did get just the slightest hint of that in that they come back and they see him being just as angry and they run away again. And
yeah,
I don't remember the graphic of it, but I feel like that frame was almost exactly like the frame from his memory. But
yes,
you're right, it would have been nice to have that discussed more.
right, or just have like it doesn't need to be like a they sit down and have coffee and debate, right? It just needs to be an exchange where like, why are you doing this? I want my family back. They're not going to be your family. Who are you
Right.
taking them away from, right? And like you know, maybe he like has a moment where he like considers, is it right for him to do this and potentially make another kingpin go through the same stuff he's going through now, but then ultimately decides to do it because villains decide to
Yeah.
make bad choices, right? But like I just that would have been interesting. The movie was still great without it, right? It didn't
Yeah.
need that. I just would have liked it.
It is an interesting point, especially because there's something a little bit weirdly asymmetrical about how it lines up because on some, as you say, there's an interesting tension that happens when our villain has a goal, but the goal isn't necessarily the best thing, or that in some ways the hero is like, no, you shouldn't have that goal. In this case, the problem has nothing to do with his goal. It's 100% his methods. And I
Yep.
feel like there's never anything of like, that I think part of the idea is that he is so single-mindedly focused on that goal that he's not willing to look at the danger that it's going to put everybody in.
Right.
But but on some level, they don't care what his goal is. They care that he's using this method that will not only not get his goal, it will destroy everything else.
Yep. And like there wasn't really time in the movie for that kind of discussion, but I would have liked our heroes to learn why he was doing this and then challenge him on it.
Yeah,
Just because, again, I like it when people use their words and then use their punches when their words don't work.
yeah.
Right?
that that would have been nice. And I will also say, as I liked the idea of him scaring off his family. Again, this is the only thing where I'm going to bring in the Netflix universe as the more positive. Um, I so love the portrayal of the character of Veronica or
Vanessa.
Vanessa in the
Hmm.
Netflix show as the one who sees his anger, sees the depths of his rage and his hate and his violence, and loves him for it, and
Hmm.
even kind of gets into it somewhat. And so I was a little sad to kind of go back to her as the kind of like, oh no, I can't believe you're this terrible person. But other than that, you're right. There was so much that was so good about it that I was totally down for it.
Well, right. And here again, we're positing in different universes, different Vanessas would react differently to
Yeah.
big bad angry kingpin. Um,
That's
that would have
definitely
been an
true.
interesting different take if he ended up like pulling through the Vanessa that's effectively the Netflix Vanessa, and
Oh
he's all
yeah,
like, "But you're nothing like the woman I fell in love with,"
yeah.
and I would just be sitting there screaming at the screen, "No kidding, you idiot!" Anyway, sorry, just
Well, and it also, and again, this may be more of a meta point, but it gets into another interesting ethical question about sort of just the way these shows are being made, because I just when you're talking about pulling through different universes, I love the idea, as you said, that Miles Morales can now be in the universe, but I think part of why you'll probably never in a million years get Vincent D'Onofrio's Kingpin in the same room with with Tom Holland's Spider-Man is because one comes from an R-rated universe and the other comes from a PG-13 rated universe.
mhm.
And I wish that wasn't the world we live in, but it kind of is. And I feel like all of this raises some interesting questions about, how do you tell stories about characters that are all fundamentally interrelated and interconnected when the context in which you can tell those stories and the kind of things you can get away with in some but not in others is radically different.
Yeah, it's tough because, and it is something the Netflix, the MCU has been struggling with, and apparently just decided to go, we're gonna scrap a bunch of this and cut all of our connections, and now Shield is not connected to the main line anymore, and it's like, yeah, because you're right. It's an excellent point when you have these different levels of storytelling, these different types of storytelling, and you have characters from one that when you bring them into the other, they have to play in that space. They have to be a character that can exist in that arena.
Hmm.
um you don't have a context to bring your audience along with, right? Like even if you took Tom Holland's Spider-Man and had him try to interact with Netflix Punisher, right?
Oh
I think
God.
that scene would be amazing, right? But one of them sort of has to conform to the other one's universe in order for it to make any sense to the audience, and then it's going to be jarring for the other character.
Right. Well, and it's something you and I have talked about a lot, and I think it's as much as we joke about how much we like the Netflix shows, part of it is that I think that as you change like, literal ratings, but also just tones of movies, one of the first things it changes is how much moral grayness are you allowed? You and I have talked about like Luke Cage and Daredevil and characters like that go through all kinds of moral wrangling about the damage that they may do to, the nameless henchmen they're fighting that Captain America and Thor never questioned for a second.
Hmm.
Um, and that alone, I feel like the Punisher asks questions that Tom Holland would never occur to him. Not that it wouldn't care to the character or the actor, but just that it's a very different framework. And it makes these fun questions, but also I think highlights the idea that, like, to some extent, these different movies and TV shows are taking place in different ethical frameworks where different kind of questions are allowed.
Yeah, it's almost like there is a an actual framework for each of them that they plug characters into, and then I don't know, it's there's some AI that's controlling a bunch of the different ones, and it's
Yeah.
probably a villain because all AIs are villains. Just just throwing that out there as an idea that they could do. It would
That's a
probably be
possibility.
bad.
I think many people at this point would argue that Kevin Feige is basically an AI, and maybe he's just in control of everything. But either way, it plays out kind of the same.
Sure.
Um, but it would actually be an interesting thing to me to like, because back in the day they would set rules for that kind of thing. It would be like, Batman can never kill anybody, Superman can never question, the authority of political leaders. Like there were all of these rules in place for characters and for the in these kind of different stories you could tell. And I am curious if this exists, we will probably never know about it. But I would love it if one day, like Kevin Feige or someone else wrote like a tell-all, behind the scenes memoir of the making of the MCU, and we found out that like here were the specific rules that were established for the MCU movies, and here were the specific rules established for animation, and here are the specific rules established for the Netflix shows of like what kind of moral grayness could you show on one but not the other.
Hmm. And I mean, the you and I, of course, both really love, for the most part, the Netflix shows because the nuance is interesting and the heroes feel more real. Um,
Right.
I also love the big blockbuster movies and loved this movie, but they're different, right?
Yeah.
They present different problems, and because of that, this Kingpin makes way more sense in this than this Kingpin would in Netflix Daredevil or Netflix Daredevil's Kingpin would in here, because this is the villain that this set of spider peoples needs, right?
Right.
They need someone that, well, first of all, they need the MacGuffin that actually gets them all in the same room together. But then they also need someone who's not going to listen to the, hey, you really shouldn't do this. Uh, and that I really did appreciate that his motivation wasn't just, well, I'm going to do this because I don't know, power or something, like some generic, you know what I mean, right?
Yeah, of
Some
course.
some generic like Disney villain level, like I'm Jafar, I want all of the power so I can stick it in my ears and stick my tongue out at people and say I have all the power.
Right.
Um, I don't know if that's 100% Jafar's motivation. It sounds more like Scar's motivation when I'm thinking about it. But anyway, we should do a podcast on Disney villains.
Oh, especially now that I've just seen Hercules and liked it, I'm 100% there.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
but because if we can spend at least 5 minutes talking about the massive amounts of violence that movie does to Greek mythology, but much as now I like the movie, but no, I think that you make a really good point there about kind of the, especially because actually one thing I think that this Kingpin does highlight in a way that the movie, well, the TV show doesn't because it's not about Spider-Man, it's about Daredevil, but is, Spider-Man is not a wimp. He's not pre-serum Steve Rogers, but he is definitely not Captain America. He is not big and strong. He is quick and wiry and agile, and he has spider strength, but he's not, built by any means. And my understanding is, especially when Kingpin was a Spider-Man villain, that part of why he was there was to really highlight that difference because Kingpin is everything that Spider-Man is not. He's this just big, huge, hulking mass of strength, and it's the exact opposite of what Peter represents. And I like that this movie highlighted that a little more. One other quick thing I'll hit on villains, then maybe we can actually wrap this up, make this kind of a shorter episode.
Hmm.
But is Doc Ock.
Mm.
Because you mentioned that the Doc Ock reveal, where we find out that this woman doctor, scientist is Doc Ock, I thought was so well done. And in particular, what I liked about her so much is that, so a couple of months ago at WisCon, I was at a presentation about She-Ra, Princess of Power, the new great TV show, and it talked about how there was one character who was not evil, she was not immoral, she was just amoral. Like, she would get so wrapped up in the science that she would kind of just forget to care about the morality of what she was doing. And Doc Ock obviously has a little bit of enjoying being evil, but mostly that was the sense I got from her, was she was never, like, she was working for Wilson Fisk, for Kingpin, because he gave her the chance to play with this awesome science.
Mm.
And she wanted to stop Peter Parker from getting in her way. And when she realized he was like from a different dimension, she wanted to experiment on him. And she certainly didn't care about the moral implications. But she didn't seem evil to me. She just seemed fundamentally amoral. Did you get that same sense from her?
So similar, there is a unfortunate trope with scientists, particularly villain scientists, where you have there's this idea that like once your scientific curiosity gets to a certain point, you just throw morality by the wayside. So I didn't really appreciate that because I don't think logic and a sense of judgment, a sense of connectivity to other human beings are mutually exclusive the way a lot of stories want us to think they are.
That's fair.
Just in the same, it's that same kind of. I think we've talked about this before. The idea that if you're extremely logical, you won't be emotional or you won't experience emotions in the same way, and vice versa is kind of
Right, that those two things are
not.
mutually exclusive.
Yeah, that's not how brains work generally. Certainly there are some people who have different, they don't process emotion the same way as you or I. But like it's not this because it's not because they're hyper logical and that's all they are. Like it isn't like there's no like literal Vulcan. So I didn't like that as much. I'm so I agree with you that like I feel like that was part of the portrayal, that like she was so interested in what could be done and what the
Mm-hmm.
possibilities were in sort of manipulating the world around her through the application of her intellect, that the consequences to the other individuals around her were not even a secondary concern.
Right.
Which is, yeah, kind of more of an amoral thing, not like intentionally causing harm, but not really caring about what harm would be caused. But what I did like was how clever this Doc Ock was, in particular, playing Spider-Man in like appearing to be this like hapless helper scientist, and having a conversation, and then again when we get that reveal, I'm like, oh, she knew all along, and like there was a power dynamic there that was only understood by one character, and I love that the character that understood it was her.
Yeah, that
If
was a
that makes
great thing.
sense. Yeah. Um.
I guess I hear what you're saying about that trope. This felt a little different to me because it felt more about like her as a person and her personality rather than just I'm a super scientist so I don't care anymore. Um, but I think that for our listeners, I'd be curious to hear other thoughts on that because I can see it going either way. And I do agree with you. I loved that how much she outsmarted everyone, and that she was often 3 or 4 steps ahead of our heroes in such interesting ways.
Yeah, and it's something that it's difficult to write and portray in film, when you have a villain who's supposed to be n steps ahead and just so much cleverer than our heroes, because they still have to win.
Right,
So at some point you have to break that. But I think they did a good job there as well, where like basically the entire villainous plan got executed to fruition, and they had to continue to adapt and adapt and adapt until finally the solution came because of something that the villains were unable to expect. Right?
right.
Miles being the rogue element, the element that nobody anticipated, because he found himself, he found his power and embraced it, and was able to use it to enact positive change in the world. Also, very a story that hits home for a lot of people, I think.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, even just the way that Doc Ock is defeated, I mean, one thing I loved about her is that she was so witty.
mhm.
She was almost as much as Peter Parker normally is, if not more so. She always had the quick joke, the quick comment about how much of an idiot somebody else was. And I loved that about her. And in some ways, it sort of felt like for any of the heroes to just flat out defeat her, like I didn't know who would be able to do it. And for her to just flat out get hit by a bus created by this weird situation that she had created, like I was like, okay, it's a little what's the word for
Slapstick,
what'd you say?
slapstick.
It's a little slapstick and it's a little anticlimactic, but it
Yes,
also felt very appropriate because it's partially like it's the scientist who thinks they can control everything, and part of it's that everything's out of control, but partially it's also that none of them actually defeated her. She just kind of got defeated by the craziness of the situation that she helped create.
I
Um,
agree. The fact that the thing that defeated her was literally dramatic irony,
yeah,
played really well.
definitely. So I think that's about all the things I wanted to cover with this movie. Was there any other last points you wanted to hit?
Uh, Actually, no. Like, I really liked the movie. Could talk about it for longer. Could talk about Nicolas Cage going full Cage, as it were,
Oh God,
um,
yeah,
because that is a lot of fun. And there's a lot of fun elements in the movie. The Aunt May in this film, sort of, welcoming everyone into her home, and like there was a lot of amazing moments in this movie. But in terms of the material for this broader discussion, I think we're about ready to wrap up.
yeah. I will. I'll say one thing on the Nicolas Cage. No, I'm sorry, not on Nicolas Cage, but on the alternate universe Peter Parker. Um, which is that when we had that conversation a couple of weeks ago about Avengers Endgame, we had a long conversation about Thor in the fat suit and how problematic that felt, and how there was some value to it that I saw, but that we both thought it was pretty problematic in some ways. Um, and I wanted to ask how you felt about what they did with Peter Parker, the older Peter Parker in this, because I felt like this was there was a couple of people who sort of pointed out the fact that he gained some weight. They made a little bit of a joke about that. But for the most part, it was just such an interesting exploration of what happens to a person who feels like they can take care of everything. Now they can't, and has somewhat gone to seed. And I felt his character was so relatable and so heartbreaking in some ways. What was your take on that version of the character?
So I had seen Into the Spider-Verse. I want to say I saw it before Endgame. I'm trying to remember the timeline, but I did notice the similarity that you're sort of, I think you're hinting at it, but you have two characters who've gone through some pretty substantial depression, and our shortcut for one of the shortcuts we use in these films for that is to have them put on weight,
Yeah,
right? Um, and then it's realistic, right? I think that's
yeah.
like not unreasonable that's a thing, right? Some people eat their feelings. I certainly eat my feelings, um, and drink my feelings, and
Hmm.
otherwise
Yep,
otherwise ingest my feelings.
I'm with you on the eating the feelings.
Yep. But it when it would have been better if it were just this happened, and to not have any characters comment on it at all. But I do
Right.
think that it was less egregious is the wrong word, because I don't think it was like egregious per se in Endgame, but there was conversations that could be had about, like, whether or
It was
not.
much more of a running joke, it felt like.
Exactly.
And I mean,
I
just the
was about to
degree of it,
make a
like,
very bad joke, so I'm glad that I didn't.
we,
So
we were talking before about how this felt very cartoonish. Like, the Thor fat suit felt much more of a cartoonish portrayal of weight gain, whereas this felt like a guy who still looked like he was in decent shape. He had just
right,
put on some pounds around the waist.
yeah, he got, well, he you know hadn't been as active and had been eating more junk food, right? And
Hmm.
like that's what happens. Like, no. Um,
Yeah.
and like generally speaking, nobody was. It wasn't this constant. There wasn't a lot of scenes where his weight played an important role, right, in the outcome of the scene, and that was it could have been handled better, but it was definitely handled better, I feel, than Thor, who had gained a little bit of weight in Endgame.
Yeah, I think that's true. All right, well, cool. Well, let's wrap it up. Thank you guys all for listening. As always, Jacob and I have thrown out some thoughts about this. We want to hear what you guys think. You can email us or find us on Facebook. We have both a page and a group. The group especially is a great way to join to post questions or thoughts or comments. And you do have to join it, but that's very easy. If you don't want to do that, all you have to do is comment on the page. You can also tweet at us or find us on email. All of those things are just superhero ethics. In the email, it's superheroethics@gmail.com. We love your feedback. We'll definitely take your feedback and hopefully get to discuss it on an upcoming episode. Um, Beyond that, you can also find other ways to reach us. I am Caped Ethicist on Twitter. Jacob.
I am Bots R, that's the letter R, people too.
Yep, and all that will be in the show notes. Other things you can do if you want to help support the podcast, best things you can do is just, talk back to us, help continue the conversation, and get your friends talking about this. I'm sure many of our listeners, you are listening, you have been talking to friends about Into the Spider-Verse, you want to hear about it. Share this podcast with your friends. We would love to get our listener numbers up, have more people hearing it, and talking about it and interacting with us. If you want to find other ways to support the podcast, we have our Patreon. Again, it's Superhero Ethics at Patreon, and that's a great way to you can give a little donation to the podcast, help support us in terms of our recording costs and sounds like that, and things like that. You can also buy some of our T-shirts or mouse pads or other swag. Again, on a link that's going to be um, on the web page for this podcast in the show notes. So, Jacob, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone else. Thank you for your patience. We are recording this in mid-July. It's going to be coming out a little bit later than that. We still have a Harry Potter episode, which I have not yet gotten to edit yet, because again, with moving, timing's been a little crazy, but hopefully by the time you're hearing this, we're going to be back on schedule and recording on a regular basis. So, thank you guys all. Have a good night.